Welcome everyone to CCSI's annual conference on leading public policy issues. CCSI, a short for the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, is an applied research center sitting at Columbia University in New York, and we are dedicated to developing and advancing policies and practices that shape investment to contribute to rather than undermine sustainable development. And I'm Perrine Toledano, the head of the Mining and Energy team at CCSI. This year, for our annual conference, we are grateful to benefit from Iberdrola's support. In the lead up to COP26, which will begin in just a few days, our conference today will focus on taking stock of the corporate intentions, ambitions, and action to achieve the Paris Agreement. And we will also discuss the way to achieve corporate alignment to the Paris Agreement. We are indeed at a critical moment in history, as the next years will be the world's last chance to get our climate change crisis under control. We are hoping that our audience will leave the conference with strong ideas on how to catalyze action. A little bit on our agenda today. From 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. East, we will discuss the credibility and reliability of net zero pledges, starting with a conversation between Professor Jeffrey Sachs and Iberdrola Chairman and CEO Ignacio Galán. They will discuss the critical role of power utilities and electrification in achieving net zero. After the interview, I will further set the scene for the conference by discussing the quality of corporate net zero pledges. From 9 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. East, we will discuss the challenges and risks of diverse carbon accounting methods with a range of experts grappling with these issues. From 10:30 to 10 p.m. East, we will ask leading companies of our global economy to take an inward look into corporate governance and discuss what internal metrics and incentives can be mobilized to shift corporate strategy towards decarbonization. We will then take a 30-minute break. And then finally, from 12:30 p.m. to 2 p.m., we will finish with a panel on the opportunities and hurdles of climate finance, discussing the role of asset owners and asset managers in aligning capital with the Paris Agreement. My colleague Brooke Govan, senior legal researcher at CCSI, will lead the audience through the panels. Without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce the interview of Iberdrola Chairman and CEO Ignacio Galán by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs is also the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University.
Ignacio, it's wonderful to be with you. I could not be more excited because I want answers to a lot of questions, and you are in the center. Iberdrola is at the very center of the challenge of decarbonization, one of the most important and dynamic companies in the world, one of the largest producers of renewable energy. So we have a lot to talk about with the COP26 coming up in just a few days, and with the G20 coming up in a few days. Maybe I could start. Can you give us some reassurance? Excuse me. Is decarbonization feasible? Can this really be done?
Well, I feel we are in a critical moment. So the data of United Nations, the temperature is 1.1 degrees versus pre-industrial times. I think it can already generate dramatic consequences. I think we need already, the world needs to reduce 45% of carbon by 2030. And we need already to be net zero in 30 years. So, which is, and I think that's a positive thing. I watched this morning just some interviews on journal, and the day before yesterday as well in London with a few of them. I think for those we've been already in this for many years. I've been attending COP since Copenhagen for 15 years. So 20 years ago, when I joined the company, I strongly believe that we have to take seriously what has already been said in Kyoto. And if we are contemplating how the thing has already evolved since the last 20 years, I'm already becoming slightly optimistic. So today is a global consensus. Policymakers, financial institutions, companies, academia, citizens. So everybody agree. I think I like to say it's a decisive decade. I think we need to decarbonize now. And I think in the second point, very important, as different of 20 years ago, is energy transition is being seen as an opportunity. So you see, yesterday, day before yesterday, with the Prime Minister Boris Johnson and with a few members that we were already in different panels in London. So everybody's seen that far from being a problem is or threat is an opportunity to reduce. I think it will improve the quality of the and the health of the people. The COVID has already demonstrated how risky it is to live in an environment which is with contaminated. That can already create economic activities in a sustainable growth. I think you see in Europe, since the ETS, European Trading System, has been established 15 years ago, economy has already grown on the range of 15, 60%. And the emission has been reduced by 30, 40%. So I think it's possible to combine economic growth with emission reduction. So
Ignacio, when we met first about 15 years ago, you said you were betting
we are very young, both of us.
Exactly. You said you were going to bet the company on going green, on going to zero. Can you just describe for everybody and also bring me up to date, what did Iberdrola do and what is the strategy and how do you see, since Iberdrola is one of the world's biggest utilities, one of the most important companies in the world, exactly in this challenge, what does it mean to lead a giant utility in a decarbonization era?
Very easy. I think now on the COP26, they are talking about the possibility of reducing or finishing with the production of coal for power generation. So we did 20 years ago. I think 20 years ago, we decided to close all our coal and oil power plants. 17 power plants has been closed. We have already invested almost 120 billion euros in renewables, in networks. Today, we are already present in 30 countries. We have close to 40,000 megawatts of renewables in our portfolio. We are supplying today electricity to almost 100 million people worldwide. We have already more than 1.2 million kilometers of smart networks where we introduced digitalization, most of them. We have already transformed all our hydroelectric power plant reversible for making already pumping storage with this one. We are investing we are investing heavily as well in batteries. So, and I think what that makes ourselves, we are 6 times bigger than we were. We are already becoming one of the 3 largest or 4 largest utilities worldwide. And we have already, our emissions is already 1/6 of our peers in Europe, United States. And I think we introduced something which I think, in my opinion, is very important. We now, we call social dividend in our bylaws. Well, now it's already SDGs, but I think we made prior of existing the SDGs, we put the social dividend, and I dedicate more time in my AGMs, in shareholders meeting, to explain about what we do in terms of this social dividend, about our economic dividend. And I think it's, and that is one not against another. Both are already absolutely possible. So it's what is our plan for the future? One is our plan for the future, which is important, that one. That is what is done. But we need to do more.
Ignacio, as you describe it, it sounds like Iberdrola is really fully integrated from generation, distribution, the grid, storage, batteries. You're bringing within the company, within this giant company, all different facets of the technological needs.
Yeah, of course. So I think if you have to provide 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, power to your customers, you have already to have all the means for providing that one. And that means power generation, renewables are intermittent by nature. So we need to already store those one. You would like to provide that one. but we need already to bring this electricity to the homes of those ones. So we need already to have already very smart grid to manage the demand when they require every moment. That's why I think our plan for the next 10 years, in the 10 years, in the next 10 years, we are planning to invest $180 billion again, in multiply by 3 our capacity in renewables to reach 100,000 megawatts of renewable worldwide, to multiply by 2 our networks asset base, to increase, and that is generating hundreds of thousands of jobs in our supply chains. That is, we are making all the necessary. We are already, for instance, in terms of equality, there is a problem. They are not really women electricians. They are not. They are not women electricians. There are a few engineers, women. We are creating schools in Brazil for already educating girls to become electricians. We are promoting in Mexico, yes, certain kind of economic support for girls to study engineering, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And more than that, we are a continuous reskilling our workforce. We have already invested close to Madrid, $300 million in a training center. You've been already there.
I know.
You were already with Teresa, with myself. So 300 million for making already, we are making 53 hours of education per employee per annum. So, and I think those things, because the new world is different, how we generate power generation, how distribute power generation. I think we're already, when my grandfather built already one of our first dams in this country. So, and that is part of this one. And in innovation and what we are making, almost more than $300 million per annum in innovation. I think companies, for instance, Wallbox, they now is listed for charges in New York. We've been already one of those who are already helping this startup to make that happen and to be successful. So I think those things. And one thing more than that, I think we are paying more than $8.5 billion per annum of taxes, which I think great means then we are a healthy company that we are able to pay. We have to contribute to the development of that one. So all those things is our model. And I'm very pleased because we are receiving quite a lot of international recognition, which I think time to time we need already as well. Then somebody said, well, you are in the right path. So we are already being with World Finance recognized as the best corporate governance. We are already in Bloomberg Gender Equality Index. We are already in United Nations Global Compact. We are Influence Map, the top of this one. So all those things is good. So means we are making that one, but shareholders recognize, society recognize, and the leaders of opinion is recognizing that one. With that, that is a good example for others to follow our track, because there are room for everybody.
What's the hardest part if a government says, okay, we get it, we need to decarbonize? What is the key for them to be able to enable companies like yours to be able to do what needs to be done in terms of regulatory, in terms of land use, in terms of market structure? What is really at the core of making this work?
Well, I've been during the last few days, I've been with a few ministers of energy in different countries. And the first thing is regulatory stability and legal certainty. I think we are making investment which is going to stand for 40, 50, even more years. So I think if we damage the investor confidence, I said yesterday in an interview in the British TV, I know the money in my pocket. I have to raise money from the markets. And I need to convince that the investment we are making is not only good for the planet, which are good for the planet, it's not only good for the countries, which can be good for the countries, but I think they have to have already a proper return and defined return and with certain stability. So I think that is very important: regulatory stability, legal certainty, rule of law. The second one is long-term vision and coherence about the climate objectives in regulation. You cannot change the thing just because there are certain storms, which are always happen. I've been 20 years in this sector, and I think time to time there are energy crises, time to time there are already something changed, but I think you have not to change our vision. What we would like to to maintain. So they're right. We have to keep already the right incentive, a price signal for investment, not changing this price signal just because anything. And something which I used to say, you know, I'm already a Jesuit education. And San Ignace, the founder of the Jesuit, used to say, then in stormy times, don't take already a structural decision. Because of a very punctual situation, you cannot already change the rules, because I think the damage can be terrific. Something which I was saying yesterday in London. So permitting process, I think is cannot be already taken. We announced yesterday an investment of, the day before yesterday, 6 billion for a huge offshore wind farm in Britain. Probably the construction is going to take 18 months, 2 years. The permitting has already taken 8 years. 8 years. With the actual, if we are not changing this one, with the actual objectives in most countries will not achieve. So I think the number of megawatt, renewable megawatt we are putting in service in most countries is less than half with those which are needed for achieving the targets that the government is already making. So can you, and the last one on this point as well is in the case, the need of networks. Networks has been traditionally the bad boy of this, all these things. Nobody cares about networks. But I think everybody's talking about electrifying transport charges. Great. We are invested in charging. Wallbox, we are one dimension shareholder. But charges, you can produce as much as you like, but behind the charges, you need already a grid, a strong and reliable grid. Everybody's talking about pumping and storage. Britain is already making 700 million pounds subsidies for already changing the boilers for pump heating. Great. But behind the pump heating is needed a stronger, powerful, reliable grid. And for that, they need already to provide already the incentives for making the necessary investment and to hurry up for making that happen.
How does it work on the grid? My sense is that most countries need to be in a regional grid that crosses national borders. I don't know if that's so important from your point of view or not, but given intermittency, isn't larger better? And then how do you do a transnational financing properly?
Well, I think interconnection in whatever manner is crucial. But I think the point is how costly is the interconnection compared with another ways of securing the supply. So if for making an interconnection, you're required to make huge investment for little power, has not much sense. You have to put already some economics behind any of those decisions. So for instance, in Spain and Portugal, we have a great interconnection. We are fully interconnected, cheap interconnection, which we can already manage both things. But if we need already to interconnect, if we did with other countries, and we need to make already through a tunnel, which is fully refrigerated with a special condition. So perhaps it's more interesting to encourage to make already power both sides of the border. So interconnection are very needed, but with economics behind, but it's very needed. I think in the case of the United States, we are already now making interconnection. We connect Canada with Massachusetts. It's great because we can take the excess of electricity of hydroelectric of Canada into Massachusetts, avoiding the endeavor continue burning oil and gas and so on. And at the same time, this connection can be already used for connecting another renewable, wind or solar from different parts. Fine, but it's already the economics of this connection has been deeply analyzed and has already very good return. So yes, interconnection, more interconnection, but with economies behind. So we are on, for instance, in New Mexico. So we have already some wind farms and we are exporting the electricity to California. Probably that can be reinforced because it's plenty of space, free space in New Mexico, cheaper space, and we can already export the solar with a strong interconnection, with economies behind.
How is your mix between wind, solar, and other zero carbon sources shaping up?
So I think in terms of installed power, the first one is wind. The second one by far, the second one is hydro, and the third one is solar. In solar, we start very late because we always, when we make investment, we analyze the economics. independent of the subsidies. And we thought that when the subsidies of solar was on the range of $400 and the wind was on the range of $20, so it said, well, I think it's better to make that one with lower subsidy, independent of our return, but to move another one when they will be more mature. Now solar is very mature and we are making solar, but it depends. I think there are certain areas with solar is very suitable because it's a lot of sun, but there are areas which is no sense because I used to say the north of Europe has not much sense to put already solar panels, and because they have a lot of wind, a little solar. And in the case of south of Europe is precisely the opposite. So it depends. There are areas which are both. There are areas which are both, and we are hybridizing. There are areas where you have sun and you have already wind, and we are using with the same connection, we are using for sun and for wind, for hydro and solar, for hydro and wind. So I think the solution is not unique. We have to work continually and making our brain work and looking what is the optimum in every case.
You have the fascinating role of being a major utility both in Europe and in the United States right now. In Europe, there is a Green Deal that supposedly, well, I mean, it does cover the 27 member states. In the United States, as typical, we have a lot of things going on the ground within states, but the federal government's a mess. I just wonder whether you could say something about what is the business environment in comparison in the US versus Europe? And do you find basically it's dynamic in both places and the federal government doesn't matter so much in the US because the action's at the state level? Or is it as confused as it looks?
Well, I think first of all, I'm very pleased in the United States. I have to say that independently of the who is already in White House, I think the United States is the civil society are already really welcoming to do anything with affect to the environment, to affect to the climate change. So I think large corporations are already, all of them would like to be as green as possible. The social responsibility and this, what I call social dividend, is already ESG is everywhere. So and I think in the last administration, at the federal level, they were not very in favor of this one. But at
that's a nice way to put it.
But in real terms, I think you've been building, we will building as much renewables as they were already in the previous one. So with this administration, the ambition are higher. I'm very pleased with that one. Certain projects were a bit, especially offshore, were a bit delayed in the permitting process. Rapidly, they have already facilitated all those one. We are absolutely welcome. The administration is behind us, is trying to help. So, and I think is the fact that you have already fixed the federal authorities emission-free power system, 100% free emission power by 2035 is very important step forward. So, and I think that is already clearly affecting in everything. What is needed? Same thing than everywhere. Stable, predictive rewards, keeping the rules, having the rule of law as the main driver of that one. Tax incentive for renewables, which has been already, you've been enforced for years, for decades. So now it's expanding, facilitate all those things. Networks, rate cases of networks, to be much more the regulators, much more ambitious about the need of a stronger and more reliable grid. So there are certain still a state which I think require more investment than that one. And we need already to have much transparent process and dialogue all together to try to how we can do as private companies, as regulators, local authorities to promote a faster deployment of the best technologies in the much smart grids for already integrated all these new sources of power generation. But I think the cooperation between federal and state level, I think for us it works. So it works.
That's so, well. This is the most heartening thing. This is the most heartening thing I've heard in quite a
No,
while.
no, I'm telling you,
Yeah.
we are planning in our plan up to 2025 is on the range of $90 billion, which 40%, around 40 billion or 35 billion is going to address the United States. More than half addressed to networks and the rest to renewables. So I think our commitment is there. I'm very proud that the first large offshore wind farm, which is going to be built in the United States, is going to be our own in Massachusetts, Vineyard Wind. I'm very pleased. And there are another 3 which are already behind. I'm very pleased on that one. And that is generating a lot of jobs, high quality jobs in the area. So we are already, only our office in Boston for this purpose is going to recruit 400 people, only that one. So, which I think is generating, same with the supply chains, which is already a lot of project which is going to be behind.
Could you say something about on the storage side, the role of batteries in the global battery supply chain, and whether you feel that this is going to be scaled up and secure for you for this massive investment underway?
You know, I was already, when I got my degree in engineering, my first job was precisely design and manufacture batteries for stationary purposes. So I was already making batteries for electric vehicles at that time, these electrical submarines and PTTs and power plant, et cetera, et cetera. So I think after 50 years, I'm coming back to my origins. So, but I think what I said is storage. Battery is a part of the storage. I think, in my opinion, we need two kind of storage. Storage, short-term period of storage with batteries is good one. I think for 1, 2, 3 hours, we can already base in a daily basis, more or less. And this one for large storage. In large storage today, the most efficient one is pumping storage, hydroelectric, where you can already pump water up and to generate electricity when you require that one with a generator. And I think that is needed, and that is very easy to be made using the existing dam without needing to make new ones. And one or more as well for certain, even today is still not very efficient, but it will be, which is hydrogen. When you have excess of electricity and you are not already demand enough, and you are not already access to pumping storage, or you are not a large battery, you can already generate huge amount of hydrogen which can be used for other purposes. So all these things all together, and many other ideas which is going to afford. So, but I think the storage today for me, first priority, large storage for hundreds of megawatts of power and millions of megawatt hours is pumping storage. Second, for short periods of time, close to the wind farms, we have already certain of our largest wind farm has already a battery beside. We can already extend this for 2, 3 hours, which is already more or less economically viable. Batteries is going, they are reducing costs, and I'm sure the prices is going to be more competitive. But meantime, I think that is another use. And I think the hydrogen is another way how to transform the electricity in gas. With this gas can be already used, it can be transformed in electricity afterwards. So, but I think
Iberdrola is also getting into the hydrogen solution.
Oh yes. I think the largest European electrolyzer is now in construction south of Madrid. And our ambition is that 100% of the Spanish ammonia will be made with green hydrogen. So we have already, this project now is in construction. And we have already reached an agreement with an American company, which is Cummins, which is going to build a huge factory here to supply the European needs. And for making large electrolyzers, the electrolyzers today are very small, 20 megawatt each or something like that. But for the needs, we need electrolyzers of hundreds of megawatt each, 200, 300 megawatt each. And today that doesn't exist in the market. That's why we have this agreement with this American company, with Cummins, to make the necessary developments to make that already achievable and possible in the next 4, 5, 6 years. But we are already, our plan is a few billions dollars to invest in that one during the decade.
Let me ask you one final question, and that is on the financing. You're going to be investing, you said more than, how much? 100 billion, you said 120 billion? Was that the number?
$180 billion up to 2030.
180 billion. What do the financial markets get it now? Is that kind of financing easier to raise now than it was a few years ago, would you say? And, you know, have the capital markets really finally gotten the message?
We have already the largest bond holder of green bonds. So we have already a high appetite of our green bonds. And we are already probably in this moment something like $25 billion or $30 billion in green bond at very good condition. We have been the largest and the first. We are already just issuing this kind of bond. We are not, for the time being, we are not any difficulties. We have already plenty of banks knocking our door for funding ourselves. We are many, anytime we make an issue of bonds, I think they are over demand of 4 or 5 times more than we can already need over our needs. We are not having any problem of funding our investment for the time being at all.
Well, let me say 15 years ago, you did tell me, absolutely, this is the way you were going to go. And 15 years onward, of course, you've built one of the biggest and most important leaders of global decarbonization. You've described all of the different technological pathways underway, and you've given us also good news on the capital markets, because in our earlier discussions, you often said they couldn't distinguish between who was really doing things and who wasn't, but it sounds to me like they're paying attention more than they were before. And I have to say, Ignacio, just on a personal note, I spend so much time with politicians, I get quite depressed. So it's been a pleasure to spend the time with you, because you're actually doing the things. And I think if I could summarize the messages, don't listen so much to the politicians bickering, because there's real change going on the ground.
So, well, I think you've been with politicians, so do I. But I think I can already use a word with the chairman of BlackRock, Larry Fitch, which I think is an important investor in Iberdrola, told me a few months ago that I think in many cases those politicians which are running the countries, they need already help, and they need people we can already give to them ideas how to improve the things, because the loyalty is not to say to them what they would like to listen. Loyalty is to say to them what is needed for the country. And I think that's me for my 50 years already in job, working in different areas, from telecom to the car industry to batteries or utilities now, always has been my drive. Loyalty is saying, even if they don't like to listen, but saying what you feel have to be said and what you feel that is correct for the country and for the citizens.
Well, one theme for me in recent years has also been less politics, more engineering. So I'm delighted to speak with one of the world's great engineers. You've been at this for a long time, and let me thank you for joining today, and congratulations on Iberdrola's leadership. It's really important and heartening to hear the scale that you're investing and developing a zero carbon economy, because the scale and that capacity is exactly what we need as we go into COP26. So Ignacio, thank you so much for the chance to have the conversation with you today. It's really a great pleasure.
Thank you very much. And yeah, last point, I think our word is 2030 will be zero net carbon.
There we go. Phenomenal.
20 years ahead of European targets. by 2030 will not have any emissions in Europe.
So thanks a lot, Prof. Jeffrey Saxon, CEO, Chairman and CEO Galen, for this really heartening interview, giving us tons of hope for decarbonization. I'm now transitioning into our overview of the corporate net zero pledges. Jack, if you can share your screen. Jack and I, my colleague Jack and I worked on this research that I will present now. Okay. So Jack, we're seeing your screen. It's fine. Okay, good. So almost 6 years ago, the Paris Agreement, as you all know, was adopted, and it marked a historic turning point on climate actions. The Paris Agreement objective is now translated into the famous phrase net zero by 2050. In this presentation that will follow and that I prepared with my colleague Jack, I will give an overview of the pledges that 35 companies have made with regards to reaching net zero emissions by 2050. The goal is to get a sense of how these pledges fall along the spectrum from declarations to meaningful plans to embedded purpose. Next slide, please. We analyze some of the largest, maybe, check, next slide, I think. Wait, is there a slide missing, Jack? Just before this one. No, just before, no? Okay, well, no worries. We analyze some of the largest companies of the most greenhouse gas intensive industries in the world, including oil and gas, mining, chemicals, utilities, cement, steel, and food processing. These sectors make up together 64% of global GHG emissions based on their direct emissions only. The two criteria we used to pick the 5 companies per sector were that they had to have a net zero target and that they had to rank within the top 10 of their sectors based on market capitalization only. Here's an overview of the companies we assessed in our research. So as we said, they are all global economic leaders in their respective industries. Next slide, please. We structured this research around 8 main questions to guide us through the analysis of the credibility of the pledges. These questions focus first on the GHG target and their types, short versus medium, intensity versus absolute, whether they include measured scope 3 emissions and whether they are aligned with science. We also looked at the consideration of these targets in planning for future capital expenditure, the use of an internal carbon price, the extent of the reliance on carbon offset in carbon capture and storage, the climate sensitivity of the corporate governance structure, and finally, the climate lobbying practices of these companies. Next slide, please. This research that is really meant to set the scene for the conference has highly leveraged the investigative research of 4 outlets. The first one is the benchmarking company profiles of the Climate Action 100 Plus initiative, which is an alliance of investors pushing GHG intensive industries to align with the climate goals. Second one is Influence Map that provide details on companies lobbying efforts, an area that would be otherwise very opaque. The third one is the Transition Pathway Initiative, TPI, also known as TPI. They analyze the preparedness of companies for the transition, and they benchmark the self-declared carbon intensity of companies against a science-based aligned trajectory. The fourth one is the Science Based Target Initiative, SBTI, that enable companies to set GHG emission targets aligned according to science and aligned with the climate goals. When none of these outlets could provide the information, we looked ourselves for additional information in companies' climate reports and other submissions. Next slide, please. We started by looking at the various commitments companies have made for the next 3 decades. The vast majority of companies have a net zero by 2050 commitment, and many also have targets to be reached in the next 2 decades. However, when it comes to short-term targets, only few companies report on their plans, with very few in the food processing and steel sectors. Short-term targets are nevertheless necessary to pave the way toward long-term targets and force immediate action and accountability. Next slide, please. When looking at targets, one needs to consider whether the indicated target is an intensity target or an absolute target. Intensity targets are a measurement of tons of CO2 equivalent per unit of activity. On the other hand, absolute emissions are a set number of tons of CO2 equivalent emitted. The trouble and the problem with intensity targets is that they can be very misleading and highly depend on the company's production. For instance, even if a company GHG intensity drops by 10%, if their production increases, their absolute emission may still increase. The use of absolute versus intensity targets is, according to our findings, a split practice, but some tech sectors, such as the oil and gas industry, are more blatantly reliant on intensity targets than others. Next slide, please. When scrutinizing targets, we also realized that the baseline year, which is a point of reference in time against which future emission reductions are measured, varies a lot throughout the sectors. The range of dates within sectors can also be particularly striking. Check, for instance, here, the cement or the utility sector. Selectively choosing a baseline year can make climate pledges appear more or less ambitious than they actually are and makes comparison quite difficult. Next slide, please. Now we're moving into the question of whether targets are aligned with climate goals. So a quick reminder on what we mean by climate goals. As a reminder, the Earth is now 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than what it was in the 1800s, which is the pre-industrial level, pre-industrial era. We are not on track to meet the Paris Agreement target to keep global temperature from exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level, which is considered the upper limit to avoid the worst fallout of climate change. In fact, according to the IPCC, we are currently on a trajectory towards a 2.7 degree increase in global temperature by the end of the century. With the help of the Transition Pathway Initiative and the Science-Based Target Initiative, we analyzed whether the targets of our selected companies align with the global climate goal. We set here that the climate goal as being well below 2 degrees to be able to accommodate TPI's assessment that goes by well below 2 degrees or above 2 degrees. Targets that are not aligned with the climate goal basically nullify the net zero pledge. Next slide, please. Our results were quite underwhelming, to say the least, with roughly 1/3 of the companies being aligned with the well below 2 degree scenario. So only 1/3. Next slide, please. Through a sectoral analysis, we found out that the oil and gas and mining sectors stand out as not being aligned. Surprisingly, the steel and cement sectors, despite being hard to abate sectors, have some companies that are aligned with the climate goals. Next slide, please. Before showing how companies perform on Scope 3 measurement and targeting, let's just remember what the 3 scopes of GHG emissions are. Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions from purchased electricity, steam, heating, or cooling. Scope 3 emissions are all other indirect emissions that occur in a company's value chain. Next slide, please. In this table, you can see the distribution of emissions among the 3 different scopes. The cement, steel, and chemical companies produce the majority of their emissions with scopes 1 and 2. The oil and gas and mining and food processing industry, however, have a disproportionate amount of emissions in scope 3. So if a company in these scope 3 intensive industries do not consider the scope 3 emissions, then the bulk of their contribution to climate change is not being considered, which is problematic. Next slide, please. Here we see the rate at which the 5 companies in each industry include their material scope 3 emissions in their targets. It appears very clearly that outside the food processing industry, companies are struggling to target scope 3 emissions. This is particularly problematic in the mining and oil and gas sectors, for which most emissions come from scope 3, as we just said with the slide just before. Next slide, please. Beyond the various scopes of emission, we looked into whether companies consider GHG emission reduction targets in planning for future capital expenditure. Capital expenditure is also known as being CapEx as an acronym. With the help of Climate Action 100+, we found that the vast majority of companies do not consider GHG emission reduction targets in planning for their future CapEx. The oil and gas industry, perhaps identifying the bleak future for fossil fuels, is the industry considering GHG emission reduction targets in their planning the most. And we can clearly say that the remaining sectors fall far behind. Worst of all, only 1 company across the entire sample directly states to align future capex with the 1.5 degree scenarios, and this is a chemical company. Next slide, please. Confirming this trend is the parsimonious use of an internal carbon price. An internal carbon price sets an internal cost on carbon emitted by the company's operation, which enables to shift investment to low carbon technologies and activities. Our findings are that the internal carbon price is either not being used or is set too low, with the exception of a few companies. The quotes we collected here from a steel company and a chemical company reflect the wide range of practices, with some companies rejecting the use of carbon pricing policies, let alone an internal carbon price, and those that fully endorse it and set it internally at a higher level than the regulatory one. Next slide, please. In an effort to reduce the carbon footprint of their businesses, some companies are turning to nature-based carbon offset to compensate their own emissions. Basically, they would purchase offset credits from an offset provider who, for instance, will conduct reforestation efforts and then deduct those offset credits from their overall emissions to appear less carbon intensive. In our sample, strikingly, 2/3 of net zero commitments made by companies rely on nature-based carbon offset, with mining and oil and gas leading the way. Next slide, please. While reforestation efforts are much needed on our planet, nature-based carbon offsets have not delivered the results they've often promised, and these high biological, regulatory, and economic reasons as to why. First, carbon storage in natural systems like trees and other plants is inherently temporary and highly reversible. In the case of forests, for instance, what happens when the forest burns down? Related to this, quantifying how much carbon is being captured by the various offset mechanisms is highly disputed. Additionally, the offset system is voluntary and unregulated. Companies are not required to disclose offset purchases. The market is fragmented and distrusted, And perhaps most importantly, the cheap availability of offsets is unlikely to persuade companies to pursue serious emission cuts. As a result, offset projects so far have often enabled polluters to continue business as usual without delivering the results they've promised. In this context, when offset is the primary solution instead of being the residual solution, the credibility of the net zero pledge of the company is doubtful. Next slide, please. We picked a few quotes from our sample showing how some companies seem to have understood that and showing how some others are still arguing that offset of high quality can be certified and are the best cost-effective solution to decarbonization. Next slide, please. Much like carbon offset, there is a strong reliance on carbon capture and storage, CCS, a technology capturing CO2 to store it. Not surprisingly, this practice is more widespread in the hard-to-abate sectors like cement and steel, which under all scenarios will have to rely on CCS for residual emissions. The problem is that CCS technology will never be at scale in a timely manner to be relied on as a primary strategy, and most sectors outside of the hard-to-abate sectors can cost-effectively fully decarbonize without it. Next slide, please. We also looked at some decarbonization-related indicators of corporate governance. The good news is that for the most part, the companies have climate change oversight at board level, which is important because theoretically, board of directors scrutinize company strategies on behalf of the shareholders, and these shareholders could be made of the Climate Action 100 plus investors, for instance. When it comes to the financial rewarding of senior executives for meeting climate goals, some sectors do engage in such incentives. However, companies in cement, food processing, and steel are very much lagging behind. Next slide, please. Companies' lobbying efforts against climate change policies and regulations have been a strong explanatory factor of our current climate crisis. These lobbying efforts can be direct through the company's own effort or indirect through the membership in an industry trade association. To understand where our company's sample stands on lobbying effort, we looked into one particular metric collected by Climate Action 100 plus, which is whether the company has a policy that requires the firm's lobbying activities, whether direct or through the trade association, to be aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. We found that most companies don't have such policy. Next slide, please. When taking the sectoral approach, we actually found that the mining companies, the mining sector, seem to be an exception to the rule. Next slide, please. When looking deeper into the trade association memberships, thanks to Influence Map, we came across that particular discouraging finding. All assessed oil and mining companies and 50% of assessed food processing companies actively retain membership in trade associations that lobby against climate change. In addition, 3 out of 5 assessed utilities lobby against climate change directly. Next slide, please. So to conclude, as we take a step back and take a look at the net zero commitments by these industry leaders in carbon intensive sectors, we find some good, bad, and ugly takeaways. On the positive side, most companies have medium-term targets to support their 2050 decarbonization commitment. In terms of corporate governance structure, most companies have climate oversight at board level. On the relatively bad side, there was not yet mainstream practice on the use of, let's say there was split practice on the use of intensity target and the use of climate-related incentives in C-suite remuneration. Beyond this, there is a large amount of fundamental changes that must occur to make net zero pledges reliable, accountable, and credible. First, there is a heavy reliance on biodiversity offset and CCS, which distract from focusing on absolute emission reduction. Furthermore, there is a general lack of short-term targets, which might explain the difficulty in seeing meaningful enough progress 6 years after the adoption of the Paris Agreement. Like any robust long-term plan, there must be steps and goals along the way. Most of the existing targets are misaligned with international and science-based climate goals. This situation sets out all these 2050 pledges for failure. The absence of GHG target consideration in CAPEX plan, let alone alignment, the internal carbon prices that are set too low or inexistent, and the absence of scope 3 targeting are also huge areas of concern. Perhaps worst of all, many of these industry leaders are still funding outdated policies that are holding back urgent climate legislation. The underlying message here is that most companies are not doing enough to ensure that their net zero pledges can become a reality, and some are even acting in a counterproductive way. We are hoping that the rest of the conference today will put forth the fundamental shifts in corporate practice and behavior that are necessary to achieve net zero. Thank you very much. On this note, Jack, we can stop sharing. On this note, I will pass on to my colleague, Brooke, that will from now on lead us from one panel to the other. Thanks a lot, Brooke.